Most walls in history were built to keep enemies out. The Berlin Wall was built to keep citizens in, and that raises a difficult question. Why would a government need a wall to stop its own people from leaving? For nearly 3 decades, a heavily guarded barrier divided one of Europe's largest cities. Concrete walls, barbed wire, watchtowers, floodlights, patrol roads, and armed checkpoints stretched across Berlin, separating families, neighborhoods, workplaces, and ordinary daily life. During the Cold War, it became one of the most recognizable symbols in the world. Throughout history, walls were usually built against enemies. They protected cities, defended frontiers, and helped states resist invasion. The Berlin Wall served a different purpose. It was not primarily designed to prevent outsiders from entering East Germany. It was designed to prevent East Germans from leaving it. This distinction gave the wall its extraordinary symbolic power. The question extends beyond Berlin itself. Governments can build prisons, they can deploy police, they can enforce laws. But can they persuade people to remain if increasing numbers no longer believe in the future being offered to them? What does it mean when departure itself becomes a statement about the system people are leaving behind? What happens when leaving becomes easier than believing? By the middle of the 20th century, these questions were no longer theoretical. Across Europe, 2 competing visions of society faced one another. Each claimed to offer prosperity, stability, justice, and a better future. Each presented itself as the superior path for modern civilization. Berlin became the place where this competition could be observed most clearly. Within a single city, different political systems, economic structures, and understandings of freedom existed side by side. As the Cold War intensified, movement across Berlin became more than a matter of geography. Every departure carried political meaning. Every crossing raised uncomfortable questions about legitimacy, belief, and confidence in the future promised by each system. By 1961, those questions had become impossible to ignore. The Berlin Wall would emerge as one government's answer. But before a wall could be built, something else had to happen first. People had to decide that leaving was worth the risk. Before the Berlin Wall existed, hundreds of thousands of East Germans were already making a choice. They were leaving. Workers left, engineers left, doctors left, students left, families left. Some sought higher living standards, others hoped for greater political freedoms. Many simply believed they would have more opportunities elsewhere. Their reasons varied, but the direction increasingly remained the same. They moved westward. By the end of the 1950s, millions of East Germans had left in the years following the Second World War. The question confronting East Germany was not whether people were departing, it was how many more would follow. To understand why so many people were leaving, it is necessary to understand the world they inhabited. By 1945, Germany had been defeated and divided between the victorious Allied powers. Berlin occupied a unique position. Although located deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone, the city itself was also divided. As relations between the Soviet Union and the Western powers deteriorated, Berlin increasingly became the frontier of a larger ideological conflict. 2 competing visions of society emerged across Europe. In the West, governments embraced market economies and political pluralism. In the East, Soviet-backed governments constructed centralized communist systems. Both claimed to represent the future. Berlin became one of the few places where ordinary people could compare those competing promises directly. Throughout the 1950s, East German authorities confronted a problem that few governments in the Soviet bloc had to face. Unlike most borders separating Eastern and Western Europe, movement between East and West Berlin remained relatively accessible. A person could travel into West Berlin and then continue onward into West Germany. Many did exactly that. The consequences extended beyond population statistics. Every departing worker represented lost labor. Every departing engineer represented lost expertise. Years of education, training, and investment disappeared with each departure. The economic effects were serious. The political implications were even more troubling. Every departure raised uncomfortable questions about confidence in the system itself. The Cold War was not merely a military confrontation, it was also a competition for legitimacy. Each system claimed to provide a better future for ordinary people. Success depended not only upon industrial output, military strength, or political control, but also upon the ability to convince citizens that life within the system was worth supporting. Migration, therefore, carried symbolic power. Every departure raised a difficult question. If communism represented the future, why were so many people choosing to leave it? Movement across the border became more than travel between places. It became a visible measure of confidence in competing systems. What were they seeking? What did they believe they would find elsewhere? And what did their departure suggest about the society they had chosen to leave behind? By the end of the 1950s, these questions had become increasingly urgent for East German leaders. Population losses continued, economic pressures accumulated, and political anxiety deepened. Open movement through Berlin had created a situation in which dissatisfaction could be expressed not only through protest, but through departure itself. People did not need to challenge the system publicly. They could simply leave it. For the East German government, this presented a growing threat. If enough citizens continued to depart, the problem would no longer be migration. It would become a public verdict on the system itself. The leadership now had to decide how to respond. East German leaders now faced a choice. The movement of citizens to the west showed little sign of slowing. Skilled workers departed, young professionals left, students pursued opportunities elsewhere. Entire families relocated. The issue extended beyond economics. Every departure suggested that increasing numbers of citizens had greater confidence in opportunities available outside the system than within it. A state that claimed to represent the future found itself watching people leave for a different one. The question was no longer whether to act, it was how to act. The leadership confronted a difficult dilemma. Allowing open movement through Berlin meant accepting continued departures and the political consequences that accompanied them. Yet addressing the problem through major political reform carried risks of its own. Relaxing control could create new uncertainties and potentially weaken the authority upon which the system depended. Neither option appeared attractive. Meanwhile, migration continued. The longer the situation persisted, the more urgent the problem became. Every month brought additional departures. Every departure reinforced the perception that confidence in the system was eroding. Increasingly, East German leaders concluded that movement itself had become the problem. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, the situation changed dramatically. Security forces moved into position across Berlin. Roads were blocked, rail connections were disrupted. Barbed wire barriers appeared along routes that had previously remained open. Soldiers, police, and construction crews established a new frontier running through the city. Many Berlin residents awoke to a different reality than the one they had known the previous day. Crossings that had long been routine suddenly became restricted. A city that had remained connected despite political division now began experiencing physical separation. The consequences were immediate. Families found themselves divided. Friends became separated. Workers discovered that familiar routes to their jobs had been interrupted. Daily routines that had existed for years suddenly became uncertain. For many residents, the most striking aspect of the wall was not its physical appearance, but its suddenness. The barrier appeared almost overnight. What had previously been a political division increasingly became a lived reality shaping ordinary life. The answer chosen by the government was no longer a policy or an argument. It was a barrier. The barbed wire did not remain temporary. Over time, improvised defenses gave way to a far more elaborate border system. Concrete walls replaced many of the earlier obstacles. Watchtowers, patrol roads, floodlights, surveillance systems, and guarded checkpoints transformed the frontier into one of the most heavily monitored borders in the world. The wall became more than a structure. It became an institution, a permanent feature of daily life that reorganized movement, relationships, and expectations throughout the city. In the most immediate sense, the wall achieved its purpose. The large-scale flow of people leaving East Germany through Berlin declined dramatically. The route that had allowed millions to depart was effectively closed. From the perspective of the authorities, the crisis that had driven the construction of the wall appeared to have been contained. But success created a deeper question. The wall had restricted movement. It had reduced departures. Yet barriers can control where people go. They cannot necessarily determine what people believe. The problem of migration had been addressed. Whether the problem beneath it had been solved remained far less certain. In the most immediate sense, the Berlin Wall achieved the objective for which it had been constructed. The large-scale movement of people from East Germany into the West declined dramatically. The route through Berlin that had allowed millions to depart was effectively closed. A problem that had troubled East German authorities for years suddenly appeared far more manageable. From the perspective of the government, the results seemed difficult to ignore. The wall had done what political arguments, economic incentives, and administrative measures had failed to accomplish. It had stopped the exodus. Yet solving one problem created a different reality. The wall did not merely alter migration patterns, it transformed daily life throughout Berlin itself. Streets that had once connected neighborhoods now ended at barriers. Familiar routes disappeared, families remained separated. Friends found themselves living on opposite sides of a frontier that could no longer be crossed freely. What had begun as an emergency measure increasingly became part of ordinary existence. People adjusted because they had little choice. Daily routines adapted to new constraints. Work, education, travel, and family life reorganized around the presence of the wall. A generation gradually emerged that had never known Berlin without it. For those born after its construction, the wall was not a shocking political event. It was simply part of the world they inherited. This adaptation revealed one of the most powerful features of political systems. Human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to normalize conditions that initially appear temporary or abnormal. Children grew up beside the wall without remembering the city before its construction. What had once appeared extraordinary to their parents increasingly seemed ordinary. The barrier remained visible, but familiarity gradually reduced the sense of exceptionality surrounding it. Its presence remained unmistakable. Its restrictions remained real. Yet over time, many aspects of life continued around it. People worked, children attended school, families built routines, the city functioned. What had once appeared shocking increasingly became familiar. Not everyone accepted the new reality. Throughout the decades that followed, individuals continued searching for ways to cross the border. Some escaped through tunnels, others attempted crossings using forged documents, hidden compartments, improvised devices, or carefully planned operations. Many succeeded, others did not. The border system evolved precisely because authorities remained concerned about continued escape attempts. Watchtowers multiplied, surveillance expanded, security measures became increasingly sophisticated. The wall reduced movement, but it never eliminated the desire to move. This distinction raises an important question. Does adaptation necessarily mean acceptance? A population may learn how to function within a system without fully embracing it. People often adjust to circumstances because daily life requires practical accommodation. Survival, work, family responsibilities, and routine continue regardless of political conditions. The appearance of stability can therefore be difficult to interpret. Stability alone cannot reveal what people truly believe. Order may reflect genuine support. It may also reflect successful control. Sometimes it reflects both at the same time. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Berlin Wall appeared to many observers as one of the permanent realities of modern Europe. The Cold War continued. The border remained heavily guarded. The division of Germany increasingly seemed embedded within the structure of the world itself. Yet permanence and legitimacy are not the same thing. A barrier can regulate movement for decades. It can reshape habits, routines, and expectations. But whether it can generate lasting belief is a different question. And that question would become increasingly important as the Cold War entered its final years. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Berlin Wall appeared remarkably successful. Nearly 2 decades had passed since its construction. The border still stood, the state still functioned. The crisis that had triggered the wall no longer appeared immediate. Escape had become far more difficult. The large-scale migration that had once threatened East German stability had been dramatically reduced. Daily life continued, institutions functioned, the political system endured. To many observers, the wall appeared to have solved the problem that had created it. Yet this conclusion depended upon an important assumption. It assumed that controlling movement and maintaining belief were ultimately the same thing. They were not. The wall could regulate behavior. It could determine where people traveled. It could restrict movement across borders. It could impose consequences upon those who attempted to leave. Through surveillance, enforcement, and physical barriers, it could shape what people were able to do. But what people do and what people believe are not always identical. A person may obey laws without admiring them. A citizen may follow rules without trusting those who created them. People often comply for practical reasons while privately holding doubts about the system around them. A population may adapt to a system without fully embracing it. The distinction is easy to overlook because both situations can appear similar from the outside. Order exists in both, yet the foundations beneath that order may be very different. East German leaders had solved the problem of departure. What remained less certain was whether they had solved the problem that had caused departure in the first place. People could be prevented from leaving, but could they be persuaded to believe? This tension extends far beyond East Germany. Throughout history, political systems have depended upon a combination of belief and coercion. Governments enforce laws, institutions establish rules, states maintain the capacity to compel obedience when necessary. But durable political systems rarely rely upon force alone. Most depend upon some degree of acceptance, habit, and confidence in the future they promise. People do not support political orders exclusively because they fear punishment. They also support them because they believe participation remains preferable to the alternatives. The challenge emerges when those foundations begin to weaken. The Berlin Wall revealed an unusual response to this problem. Rather than addressing dissatisfaction by making departure less attractive, the government made departure more difficult. Rather than strengthening confidence directly, it restricted the ability to act upon declining confidence. The distinction mattered because the two approaches addressed different problems. One attempts to increase confidence. The other attempts to reduce options. This strategy achieved important short-term results. Migration declined. Stability increased. The system survived. Yet the wall also created a paradox. The more successful it became at preventing departure, the harder it became to determine whether remaining citizens genuinely supported the system or simply lacked the ability to leave it. This ambiguity became increasingly significant during the later decades of the Cold War. From the outside, stability appeared intact. The border remained secure, institutions continued functioning, and the state preserved authority. But beneath this appearance, confidence could not be measured as easily as movement. Belief is harder to quantify. Political systems often appear strongest shortly before unexpected moments of crisis precisely because visible order does not always reveal invisible belief. The absence of open opposition does not necessarily indicate the presence of genuine support. By the late 20th century, pressures began accumulating across much of Eastern Europe. Economic difficulties, political stagnation, and growing demands for reform gradually challenged assumptions that had once appeared secure. The structures sustaining communist governments remained powerful, but their confidence increasingly appeared less certain. The wall still stood. The border remained guarded. The mechanisms of control continued operating. Yet whether control could ever become belief remained unresolved. Beneath the appearance of stability, important changes were already underway. Can a barrier persuade people to believe? Or can it only prevent them from acting upon disbelief? The answer would emerge during the final years of the Cold War. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall appeared to many observers as one of the permanent realities of the modern world. Concrete barriers, armed checkpoints, surveillance systems, and guarded frontiers divided the city so completely that the separation increasingly seemed woven into history itself. What had once been introduced as an emergency response gradually came to resemble a permanent condition. Yet political systems often begin weakening psychologically long before they weaken physically. By the late 20th century, pressures were accumulating across much of Eastern Europe. Economic difficulties persisted. Demands for reform expanded. Confidence in communist governments increasingly came under strain as populations questioned institutions that had once appeared stable and secure. The structures of control remained visible. The certainty sustaining them became less clear. Institutions remained in place, but confidence in the future they promised increasingly came into question. A barrier can regulate movement. It cannot resolve every problem that caused movement in the first place. In 1989, these pressures intensified. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments confronted growing instability as assumptions that had shaped the post-war order began to weaken. When the Berlin Wall finally opened in November 1989, the event carried significance far beyond the removal of a border. Crowds gathered, crossings opened, families reunited. A division that had shaped daily life for nearly 3 decades suddenly began disappearing. For years, the wall had seemed permanent. Generations had grown up beside it. Many people had come to regard the division of Berlin as one of the fixed realities of modern Europe. Yet within a remarkably short period of time, assumptions that had appeared stable for decades began to unravel. The importance of this moment extended beyond Berlin itself. The wall had succeeded in controlling movement. It had reduced departures. It had survived for decades. Yet survival and legitimacy are not identical. Its collapse revealed a limitation that had existed from the beginning. Control and belief are not identical. Political systems can regulate behavior through institutions, laws, and barriers, but long-term stability depends upon something more difficult to secure. It depends upon confidence. The wall fell not because the concrete suddenly weakened, but because the political confidence sustaining it had weakened first. The Berlin Wall became one of the defining symbols of the 20th century because it transformed an invisible conflict into visible reality. Political division took physical form. It became part of everyday life. Yet its fall revealed something equally important. Concrete can divide cities, but it cannot permanently settle the question of what people believe. The history of the Berlin Wall is therefore not only a story about borders, ideology, or the Cold War. It is a story about the relationship between power and belief, between control and legitimacy, and about the limits of what barriers alone can achieve.